Maya Ellison had learned the exact sound of the Sakamoto estate before she ever learned the name of the man who owned it. The gravel drive crunched differently depending on which car rolled over it. The heavy black sedans with the tinted windows moved slow and deliberate, tires settling like they had somewhere important to be and no reason to hurry getting there. The delivery trucks rattled, loose in their frames, driven by men who never lingered past the loading dock. And on the mornings when the house itself seemed to hold its breath, no cars came at all, only silence, thick and watchful, pressing against the windows like weather rolling in off water nobody could see from the estate's high stone walls. She had worked there 8 months, cleaning floors that cost more per tile than she made in a month, dusting shelves that held porcelain older than her grandmother, and in that time she had learned to read the house the way sailors read the sky before a storm. She was 24, full-figured, quick on her feet despite her size, with a laugh she'd been told carried too far down quiet hallways. She kept it low now. She kept most things low in that house. It paid better than anything she could find without the degree she never finished, and it came with a small room off the servants' wing that beat the apartment she'd shared with 3 roommates back home, so she told herself the quiet was a fair trade for the money and the roof. Ren Sakamoto ran the estate from a wheelchair that had become, in the 2 years since a bullet shattered 3 vertebrae in his lower spine, as much a part of him as his own hands. He was 38, sharp-jawed, with black hair kept short and precise, and eyes that had a way of pinning a person still even from across a room. He had once, by every hushed account she'd gathered from the kitchen staff over months of half-caught conversation, moved like something dangerous and beautiful, quick and certain in a way men in his world respected and feared in equal measure. Now he moved by wheel and by will, and the will, everyone agreed, had lost none of its edge. If anything, confinement had sharpened it, the way a blade left untouched in its sheath keeps its edge longer than one worn carelessly at a man's side. Maya had learned not to speak to him unless spoken to first. Every member of the household staff operated by that same unwritten rule, passed down through whispered instruction rather than any formal orientation. You did not meet his eyes for longer than a greeting required. You did not linger in rooms he occupied. You did not, under any circumstances, offer opinions on matters that were not your business. She had followed that rule faithfully for the better part of 8 months, moving through the mansion like a careful shadow, until the morning she broke it, without meaning to. She had gone into the east study to collect the breakfast tray, expecting it long emptied the way it usually was by that hour, and found him instead still seated by the tall windows, a folder untouched in his lap, his tea gone cold in its cup, his knuckles pale where they gripped the armrest of his chair. The light through the glass fell across his face, at an angle that made the tired lines around his eyes look deeper than she'd noticed before. "Leave it," he said without turning. "I'll ring when I want it cleared." She should have gone. She had every reason to. Instead she looked at the untouched tray, the second one that week by her count, the rice gone hard and cold, the egg untouched beside it, and something stubborn in her, something her grandmother used to call her most troublesome inheritance, kept her rooted in place. "You haven't eaten today," she said. He turned his head slowly, and something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, at the sound of her voice at all, at the fact that she had spoken without being addressed first. "Excuse me? You haven't eaten today," she said again, steadier now that the words were already loose in the air and there was no calling them back. "I've worked this kitchen long enough to know what comes back full and what doesn't. This is the second tray this week that's gone back untouched. And you've decided that's your business." "Somebody's business ought to be," she said, and then, because there was no one saying it now, she pushed further, her voice quieter but no less firm. "I don't know what's wrong, and it isn't my place to ask, but I do know a man can't run an empire on cold tea and an empty stomach, sir, and it doesn't seem like anybody else in this house is willing to say so." The room went still. Outside, the koi in the garden pond broke the surface once, a flash of orange against the gray morning water, and slipped under again without a sound. She braced for the dismissal she was sure was coming, already composing in her mind the apology she would offer, the promise that it would not happen again, the quiet hope that he would let her keep her job despite the overstep. Instead, Ren studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face with an attention that made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't have a name for yet. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maya," she said. "Maya Ellison." He repeated it slowly, like he was weighing it, turning it over the way a man might turn over a coin whose value he wasn't yet sure of. "Bring me something plain. Rice, maybe an egg. Nothing heavy." "Yes, sir." "And Maya." She paused at the door, her hand already on the frame. "Don't apologize for what you just said. I have men who've served this family for 15 years who would not have said it." She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing at all, and left, and told herself the warmth spreading through her chest was only relief at keeping her job. The weeks that followed did not transform anything overnight. She still scrubbed floors, still avoided the men stationed at the gates with their jackets cut a little too generously to hide what sat beneath them, still steered clear of the wing where deals were struck behind doors that never fully closed, where the low murmur of voices sometimes carried a hardness that made her walk faster past them. But something between her and the man in the wheelchair had shifted, small and easily denied, the way a single crack shifts glass without shattering it. He began asking for her by name when his tray needed clearing. He began eating more, though he offered no explanation for it, and the kitchen staff traded looks she pretended not to notice, the older women exchanging glances over the stove that said more than any words would have dared. It was Michiko Endo, the head housekeeper, a narrow woman in her 50s whose face gave away nothing and whose eyes missed everything, who cornered Maya in the pantry one afternoon among shelves of dried kelp and rice, the smell of soy and vinegar hanging thick in the small space. "Be careful," Michiko said, without preamble, the way she said most things. "Careful of what?" "Of believing you understand a man like Sakamoto-san, because he learned your name." Maya felt heat climb her neck. "I'm not thinking anything of the sort." "Good," Michiko said, clearly unconvinced, her eyes narrowing slightly as though she could read the denial for exactly what it was.
"Keep it that way."
A man in his position survives by calculation, not sentiment. Even his kindness has a purpose. I have seen women in this house mistake his attention for something softer than it is, and I have seen what becomes of that mistake. What becomes of it? Michiko only shook her head, unwilling to elaborate further, and turned back to her inventory of dried goods. The conversation closed as firmly as a door. Maya carried that warning with her the way she carried most things she didn't want to examine directly, told herself it changed nothing, because bringing a man his tea and speaking one honest sentence to him didn't amount to anything worth a warning. But in the weeks that followed, she noticed she began to look forward to the mornings she carried his tray up, noticed the particular hush of the study in the hour before noon, the slant of gold light through the tall windows, the way he sometimes spoke to her of nothing consequential at all, the koi, a book he kept rereading, the weather over the bay visible in the far distance beyond the estate walls, as if he simply wanted a voice in the room that wasn't reporting to him or asking something of him, a voice that didn't come attached to some request for his time or his money or his protection. She learned him slowly, the way water finds cracks in stone. She learned he had built the legitimate face of the family's holdings almost single-handedly, the shipping routes and property investments that let the Sakamoto name breathe easy in daylight, while its other business moved in shadow, unseen by anyone who didn't already know where to look. She learned, from an offhand remark by one of the drivers while she waited for a delivery to be signed for, that before the shooting he had been the kind of man other men in his world crossed the room to avoid provoking, quick and exact and entirely without hesitation, a man whose reputation had traveled well beyond the borders of his own territory. She learned that the identity of whoever had put the bullet in his spine had never been confirmed, despite 2 years of quiet, relentless investigation, and that not knowing sat in him like a stone he carried everywhere and never once set down, a weight visible in the particular way his jaw tightened whenever the subject came anywhere near the surface of conversation. And, in time, she learned about Hannah. It was Michiko who finally told her, in the same flat voice she used for everything, delivering the history like weather rather than tragedy, the words coming out clipped and practiced as though she had recited them before and would rather not have to again. Hannah had been Ren's older sister, the last of his immediate family after their parents' deaths from illness years apart, and she had been killed 4 years earlier in a dispute with a rival organization that had wanted to send the Sakamoto family a message about territory they believed belonged to them. Ren had not been in the room. He had been 2 floors away, finishing a negotiation he believed mattered more at the time, and by the time he understood what was happening in the East Wing, it was already finished, the damage already done, the message already delivered in the cruelest way possible. He rebuilt what remained of the family's standing in the years after, with a controlled fury that Michiko said had unsettled even his own lieutenants, men who had seen violence before but had never seen a man channel grief into strategy with such precision. Until the day, 2 years later, a bullet took the last of his mobility and, with it, whatever fury had been left to burn, leaving behind something quieter and more dangerous in its place. He does not speak of her, Michiko said. Do not ask him to. Maya never did. But she understood him differently after that. Understood the particular stillness he carried through every room, the way his gaze sometimes drifted when the pond caught certain light in the late afternoon, the way he refused, always, to let anyone else push his chair, insisting on his own hands on the wheels as though that much control, at least, remained non-negotiable. The one territory nobody was permitted to take from him twice. There were other small things she noticed in those early months, things that built a fuller picture of the man beneath the reputation. He kept a shelf of books in the study that had nothing to do with business, worn paperbacks with cracked spines that suggested they had been read more than once. He preferred the garden in early morning before the household fully woke, and more than once she found evidence that he had wheeled himself out there alone. Tire tracks pressed faint into the dew on the stone path, though he never spoke of it, and she never asked. He was, she came to understand, a man who had built 2 entirely separate lives inside the same body, one that ran an empire with cold precision, and one that sat quietly with grief in rooms nobody else was permitted to enter, and the line between them was thinner than anyone in that house, save perhaps Michiko, seemed to realize. The trouble arrived that spring in the shape of a rival syndicate calling itself the Fujimori Group, men who had circled the Sakamoto territory for over a year, sensing weakness the moment word of Ren's condition leaked past the estate's walls the way such things always eventually leaked, through a careless word or a bribed guard or simple observation from men patient enough to watch and wait. Maya didn't understand the particulars, only the atmosphere that came with them. Extra men stationed at the gates, unfamiliar faces rotating through positions that used to belong to men she recognized, phone calls that dropped to whispers the moment she entered a room, a tension humming through the house like a wire-pulled taut that everyone could feel but nobody spoke of directly. It was during this stretch that she found herself, more than once, lingering just outside the study door longer than her duties required, listening to the low current of Ren's voice on calls she wasn't meant to hear, telling herself she was only checking whether he needed anything, knowing that wasn't the whole truth, knowing there was some part of her that simply wanted to be near enough to know he was all right. The evening that changed things came in early spring, when most of the senior men had been sent to handle a matter down at the docks, and the estate sat unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like held breath. Maya had stayed late finishing inventory in the linen room, counting sheets and towels by lamplight long after the rest of the staff had gone home, and on her way back to the servants' wing she passed the study and saw the light still burning, the door left ajar, Rin seated exactly where he always sat, except this time his shoulders had curled forward in a way she had never once seen, his hands pressed flat against his face, his whole posture folded in on itself, like something bearing a weight. Too large for the room. She should have kept walking. Every instinct built over 8 months of careful invisibility told her to keep walking, to give the man his privacy, to remember her place in a house that had made her place very clear from her first day. Instead, she knocked softly against the frame. "I said I didn't want to be disturbed," he said, without lifting his head, his voice rough in a way that pulled at something in her chest she hadn't expected to feel. "It's only me," she said. He looked up, and for one unguarded second she saw something in his face she suspected almost no one in that house had ever been permitted to see, something raw, exhausted, entirely human, stripped of the careful control he wore the way other men wore their suits. He composed himself quickly, but not quickly enough to hide the redness at the corners of his eyes, the evidence of something that had clearly been building for longer than the last few minutes. "What do you want, Maya Ellison?" "Nothing," she said. "I saw the light on. I wanted to be sure you were all right." "I am always all right," he said, the words automatic, worn smooth from years of repeating them to anyone who dared ask. "You don't have to be. Not with me." He looked at her a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and then, quietly, as though the words surprised even him as they left his mouth, he said, "Today is the anniversary of my sister's death." Maya's breath caught, though she said nothing of what Michiko had already told her weeks before in the pantry. She only stepped further into the room, closer than she had ever stood to him, and said, "I'm sorry." "Everyone is sorry," he said. "Sorry does not return her to this house." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but I don't think you need it fixed. I think you need somebody willing to sit with it a while instead of pretending it isn't there." He stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he hadn't expected to understand, and then, slowly, he nodded. She pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat, not too close, close enough, and the silence between them stopped feeling empty and became something else instead, something that held them both steady in a way words might only have broken. "You are not what I expected," he said eventually. "What did you expect? Someone afraid of me? Or someone who wanted something from me? Everyone in this house wants something. My men want protection. My rivals want territory. Even Michiko wants my approval, though she would never admit it. And what do you think I want?" He considered her for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face with an attention that made the quiet feel charged, though neither of them acknowledged it yet. "I don't know yet. That is the strange part. I have not worked it out. Maybe I don't want anything," she said. "Maybe I just think you're a man who's spent longer alone with his grief than any person should have to, and nobody around here seems willing to sit in it with you." Something eased in his face, something close to relief, and his hand drifted near hers on the armrest before he drew it back, as though catching himself doing something he had no right to do. "Thank you," he said simply. "Go home. It's late." She went, but she carried the moment with her the whole drive back to the small room she rented near the harbor, the streets quiet and orange under sodium lights, turning it over, trying to decide what it meant, trying to decide what it was safe to let it mean. In the days that followed, something had settled between them that hadn't been there before, a familiarity neither of them named aloud but both seemed to acknowledge in small ways. He asked, more than once, whether she'd eaten herself, a small reversal that caught her off guard the first time it happened. He mentioned, in passing, a favorite dish from his childhood, a dish she found herself asking the kitchen staff how to prepare, though she told herself it was only curiosity. When she brought it to him one morning, plain and unannounced, he went very still for a long moment before thanking her in a voice that carried more weight than the words themselves. The threat from the Fujimori group sharpened as the weeks wore on. Maya came to understand, in the fragmented way anyone outside the organization understands such things, that a deadline was approaching, a territory dispute that would settle one way or another within the month, and that the men beneath Rin carried a nervousness she hadn't seen in him before, a tightness in their movements that hadn't existed months earlier. She heard raised voices behind closed doors more than once, arguments that cut off the moment a servant's footsteps were heard approaching. She saw new faces at the gates she didn't recognize, men who watched the grounds with a different kind of attention than the usual staff. She watched Rin himself grow sharper, more focused, the grief she'd witnessed folding itself back beneath a composure that seemed, if anything, more absolute than before, as though he had decided that whatever softness had surfaced that night in the study needed to be locked away again until the danger passed. It was during this stretch that she came upon something she was not meant to see. She had entered the study to return a book he'd asked her to retrieve from the library, and found a folder left open across the desk, papers spread that she should not have looked at and could not stop herself from seeing. Shipping manifests with numbers that matched nothing legitimate. A name circled twice in red ink that she recognized, with a jolt, from a news article months back about a man found in a warehouse near the harbor, dead under circumstances the article had called unexplained. A handwritten note in the margin, The ink pressed hard enough into the page that she could feel the indentation when her fingers brushed it by accident. She closed the folder fast, hands unsteady, set the book on the desk, and turned to go, only to find Run in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't read, his wheelchair blocking the only way out. "You saw that," he said. "Not a question. I didn't mean to. That changes nothing about what you saw." She swallowed hard. "I won't say anything." "You should be afraid right now," he said, wheeling further into the room, his eyes steady on hers. "Most people would be." "Should I be?" He was quiet a long moment, studying her the way he might study a report whose contents he hadn't yet decided how to interpret. "No," he said at last. "You shouldn't. I don't know what that says about me, that I trust you not to fear me, but I do." "Then trust it," she said. "I clean your house. I bring you your tea. What you carry beyond that belongs to you. That's a dangerous loyalty to offer a man you barely know." "Maybe," she said, "but I've watched you 8 months. I know enough." He studied her, and something in his shoulders loosened, some tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding easing out of the room. "There are men who've known me 20 years and understand me less than you do after 8 months, he said. "I don't know whether that should comfort me or unsettle me." "Maybe both," she said, and for the first time she watched him smile, truly smile, not the shadow of one he usually offered but something open and unguarded that changed the whole shape of his face, made him look younger, lighter, more like a man than an institution. That was the moment she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had begun to care for him in a way that reached well past the professional distance she had sworn to keep. She thought of Michiko's warning in the pantry, of the danger circling the estate, of the vast gulf between her life and his, and told herself firmly that whatever this was could not be permitted to grow into anything more. She held to that resolve for exactly 11 more days. Those 11 days passed under a rising tension that made itself felt in every corner of the estate. The extra men at the gates doubled again. Deliveries were searched more thoroughly than she had ever seen. Even Michiko, who never betrayed a flicker of worry over anything, moved through the halls with a brisker step than usual, as though she too could feel the weight of whatever was gathering just beyond the walls. Maya kept her head down and her hands busy, throwing herself into work the way she always did when she needed somewhere to put her nerves, but even the rhythm of her chores couldn't quiet the awareness she now carried of Run in every room he occupied, an awareness she had stopped being able to pretend away. The confrontation with the Fujimori group came to a head on a night the estate went into full lockdown, extra men posted at every entrance, the household staff confined to the servants' wing until further word. Maya had been asked to stay late helping prepare rooms for relatives arriving from a branch of the family up north, and it was in the middle of that chaos, moving between rooms with an armful of fresh linens, that she overheard a conversation not meant for her, 2 men speaking low and fast near the west stairwell about a meeting proposed for the following week. A meeting the Fujimori group had framed as negotiation but which one of the men suspected was cover for something else entirely. A chance to draw Run out of the one place he was hardest to reach. She didn't know what to do with what she'd heard. She wasn't part of this world. It wasn't her place to involve herself in matters of territory and blood loyalty she barely understood. But she thought of Ren's face in the study that night, the grief he had allowed her to witness, and she thought of what it would mean if he walked into a trap, because no one had thought to warn him plainly enough, and she made a decision she knew, even as she made it, would change something between them for good. She found him in the study, as she always did, and told him everything she'd heard, the names, the tone in the men's voices, the specific unease that had colored their talk of the proposed meeting. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when she finished he sat quiet a long moment, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, as though he were already turning the information over from every angle. "You didn't have to tell me this," he said finally. "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because I couldn't hold on to something that might get you hurt and say nothing about it," she said. "I don't understand your world. I don't want to, not really. But I understand you, at least a little, and I couldn't live with myself if something happened that I might have stopped." He wheeled himself closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, close enough that the air between them felt charged with something neither of them had yet named. "You have put yourself at risk simply by telling me this," he said quietly. "If anyone learns you overheard that conversation, I know, and you told me regardless. I told you regardless." He reached out, and this time he didn't stop himself, his hand closing gently around hers, his thumb moving once, softly, over her knuckles. It was the smallest gesture, barely anything at all, and it landed in her chest like something enormous. "Maya," he said, and it was the way he said her name, slower than usual, weighted with something he had clearly been holding back longer than she'd realized, that told her everything between them had shifted, whether either of them was ready or not. In the days that followed, the house moved with a controlled urgency she had never witnessed before. She caught glimpses of it in passing, men arriving and departing at odd hours, low conversations that ended the moment she entered a room, a sense that some machinery larger than herself had been set into motion. She did not ask questions. She had learned, by now, exactly which questions were hers to ask and which belonged entirely to a world she had no place in. "You called off the meeting," she said one morning, days later. It wasn't a question. She had heard, through the estate's quiet channels of gossip, that the proposed negotiation had been cancelled the next morning, that Ren had instead sent word demanding the Fujimori group meet on Sakamoto ground instead, under terms his own men controlled from the start.
"I did," he said.
"Because of what you told me."
"I'm glad."
"You may have saved my life, Maya Ellison. I want you to understand that I know it. I am not a man who forgets a debt, and I am especially not one who forgets this kind. I didn't tell you to be owed anything."
"I know," he said.
"That is exactly why it matters as much as it does." The days leading up to the negotiations stretched taut with an anticipation that touched every part of the household. Maya found herself unable to sleep properly, lying awake in her small room listening for the sound of cars on the gravel drive, imagining every possible outcome and finding none of them settling. She thought of asking Michiko what to expect, but something in the older woman's guarded expression whenever the subject came up told her the answer would offer no comfort. So she waited, the way everyone in that house seemed to be waiting, holding her breath alongside walls that had learned long ago how to hold silence. The negotiation on Sakamoto ground, when it came, sent a tension rippling through the entire household even from a distance. Maya was kept far from the meeting itself, confined with the rest of the domestic staff to the far wing, but she felt the weight of it in the air, in the extra men stationed at every window, in a silence that settled over the house like a held breath. She spent the hours moving between windows she wasn't supposed to look out of, catching only glimpses of unfamiliar cars parked in careful rows along the drive, of men in dark suits moving with the particular stillness of people trying very hard not to look nervous. When word finally came that the meeting had ended without incident, that the Fujimori group had stood down once they understood Ren had anticipated their plan from the start, she felt a relief so total it nearly buckled her knees. She found him afterward in the study, exhausted but unmistakably steadier, and she didn't think, didn't plan, only crossed the room and let her hand rest against his shoulder, a gesture of comfort more than anything else. He looked up at her, and the exhaustion in his face gave way to something softer. "It's over," he said. "For now, at least. There will always be another threat. That is the nature of the life I lead. But this one at least is finished." "I'm glad," she said again, because she didn't have better words for the size of what she was feeling. "Maya," he said, "I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish it before you decide you already know what I mean." She waited. "I spent 2 years in this chair believing everything worth protecting in my life had already been taken from me," he said. "My sister, my legs, my ability to move through the world the way I once did. I told myself whatever remained of me was only good for running what was left of my family's business, and that anything softer than that had died with her. And then you started bringing me tea, and asking whether I'd eaten, and looking at me like I was a man and not an obligation, and I did not know what to do with that. I still don't, entirely, but I know I no longer want to pretend it isn't there." Maya felt something in her chest crack open gently, the way ice gives way to spring. I've spent weeks telling myself this couldn't be anything, she admitted. That I clean your house, and you run an empire I don't understand, and there's no version of this that makes any sense. And, do you still believe that? No, she said quietly. I don't think I do. He reached up and took her hand again, and this time he didn't let go, and they stayed like that a long while, saying nothing further, because for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the silence between them held nothing that needed fixing. In the weeks after, nothing changed so dramatically that anyone in the house could point to a single moment and say, there, that was when it happened. But Michiko noticed, the way she noticed everything, the particular ease that had settled into the study each morning, the way Ren's eyes tracked Maya whenever she moved through a room, the way Maya no longer flinched when she caught herself smiling around him. Michiko said nothing further about caution. Perhaps, in her quiet way, she had decided that whatever this was had already proven itself steadier than she'd feared it would be. There came a morning when Maya found a second cup already set beside the tea tray without having asked for one, and when she glanced toward Michiko in the kitchen doorway, the older woman only turned back to her work, saying nothing, her silence its own quiet form of blessing. Maya did not stop being a maid. She still scrubbed the long corridors, still folded linens into precise thirds, still gave the men at the gates a wide, respectful berth. But she no longer felt any need to make herself small in the process. She had learned, in the 8 months since she first pushed her cart down the east corridor, that a man's power did not have to mean her invisibility, that honesty offered plainly was its own kind of strength, and that the world Rin Sakamoto moved through, however dangerous, however far from anything she had known before, had room enough in it for a woman who refused to disappear. There were quieter changes too, ones that took longer to notice. Ren began joining her for the evening meal some nights, in the small kitchen alcove rather than the formal dining room, a shift that startled the kitchen staff the first few times it happened. He asked about her life before the estate, her family, the roommates she left behind, the degree she still hoped one day to finish, and he listened in a way that made clear he was actually listening, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. She, in turn, began to understand the parts of him that had nothing to do with territory or debt or the careful architecture of power he maintained during the day. The books he loved, the quiet humor that surfaced rarely but genuinely when it did, the particular tenderness he showed toward the koi in the garden pond, feeding them himself each morning with a patience that seemed to belong to an entirely different man than the one who ran an empire from behind a desk. One evening, months after the threat from the Fujimori group had faded into the ordinary hum of the family's business, Maya found Ren by the tall window in the study, watching the koi turn their slow circles beneath a darkening sky the way he always had, except now, when she entered, he turned to look at her at once, no longer lost first in whatever grief or calculation had once claimed his attention before anything else. "You're staring again," she said, setting his tea down beside him. "I'm allowed to stare at what I intend to keep close," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice now that hadn't been there 8 months earlier, a warmth she had watched grow slowly, deliberately, the way anything real gets built. "Is that what I am? Something you intend to keep close?" "You are the only thing in this house I have never had to calculate," he said. "Everyone else I measure. Every gesture, every word, weighed against what it might cost me. With you, I have never once needed to measure anything. I don't know how to explain that, except to say it is rare, and that I don't intend to let it go." Maya sat down across from him, in the chair she had long since claimed without either of them ever discussing it, and looked out at the koi pond beside him, the two of them quiet together in a silence that had long since stopped feeling like distance and had become, instead, something closer to home. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "That is the only certainty left to me in this world that comes without a price attached, and I intend to hold on to it for as long as you'll allow me." She reached over and took his hand, the way he had once taken hers, and outside the window the koi kept turning their slow, patient circles, indifferent to everything but the water that held them, and Maya thought, not for the first time, that some things did not need fixing at all. Some things only needed someone willing to sit beside them, quietly, and stay. The house around them carried on the way it always had. The drivers pulling in and out along the gravel drive, the men at the gates trading shifts in the fading light, Michiko moving through the kitchen with her usual unreadable calm. But something in the rhythm of that house had changed in ways only the two of them fully understood, a warmth that had grown in a place built for cold precision, a softness that had found room to exist without threatening the strength it lived alongside. Maya thought of the woman she had been 8 months earlier, pushing her cart down the east corridor for the first time, careful and quiet and certain she needed to disappear into the walls to survive there, and she barely recognized her anymore. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more, because there are so many stories just like this one waiting for you.